So for those who are not familiar with Oatlands, we're a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The property has been owned by the trust since 1965 when the Eustis family donated the property. And Oatlands is on the unceded ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Manahoac and other nations whose history we are still learning. And Oatlands is a site of enslavement and had the dubious distinction of being the largest plantation in Loudoun County at the start of the Civil War, actually by 1850, in both enslaved labor and land. And our mission is to recognize and to honor the people who came before us and to tell a full and accurate story about that history. And so the program we're holding today fits that mission of telling little known or unknown stories. African American men, both free and enslaved, served on both sides during the Revolutionary War. Yet that story is one that historically hasn't been told. They served courageously and with honor, even though fighting for freedom did not mean freedom for everyone. And today's speakers, Marvin-Alonzo Greer and John Rees, will share some of those unknown stories. And this program is the second in a three-part series, speaker series, made possible by a grant from the VA 250 Commission in partnership with Virginia Humanities. And I have some props up. Well, that's okay. I'll show them later. We have a rack card. Our local Loudoun 250 committee just came out with a fabulous booklet that Travis is going to hold up over here. They're free. It's a great resource for learning more about Loudoun County during the Revolutionary War, so I encourage you to take one. Also, there's a rack card out there where you can, we're refreshing the rack card, so it's a new one's coming out, but there's a QR code on there, so you can link to the site, visit Loudoun's site, where you can track what other programs are coming up. For example, we have another one next Saturday, March 8th, about the people who were enslaved at Oak Hill, and many of you have heard about Oak Hill has been in the news lately. We're trying to make that a state park. Also, March 22nd, we have another program back here that's part of the grant about seeking freedom during a time of independence, about local people who were petitioning for their freedom during that time period. And then Alicia Cohen is going to tell you one about that she's doing at Russ Library. So we like to know where everybody's coming from. So anybody who's here not from Loudoun County? Okay. Anybody from out of state? Three people. Anybody drive more than 50 miles? I didn't know you did. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for those who traveled a distance to be here with us today. Thank you. Our partners in today's program are the Black History Committee of the Friends of the Thomas Balch Library and the Clerk of Circuit Court Historic Records Room. And both are set up in the room opposite here. And so I encourage you, after the program is done, to stop by and to see their displays. And also John has his latest book for sale out there in the middle room, along with a display of some of the artwork related to that book. Lastly, I'm going to encourage you to sign up for our monthly e-newsletter so you hear about our programs ahead of time. And now I'm going to turn things over to Alicia Cohen from the Black History Committee to welcome all of you, then Eric Larson, and then we're going to turn the program over to our presenters, Marvin-Alonzo Greer and John Rees. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alicia Cohen, and I'm a member of the Black History Committee. Oh, okay. Sorry. Should I start again? Is this live? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This right here a little bit better? Okay, good. Okay.
We're live streaming. It's
right.
Yay!
As I had said, I'm a member of the Black History Committee and also a member of the Loudoun VA 250, and that's the organization commemorating the 250 for our new nation. And I'm here as a partner with Oatlands and also working with Eric and his staff and we're all trying to help everyone better understand the Revolutionary War and the lives, stories, and contributions of brave men and women during that period. My interest has been related to the stories and contributions of Black patriots and loyalists. Through my readings and research, I have wanted to share what I've learned, realizing history is whole when the entire story is told. Okay. To our speakers, Mr. Rees, your book, They Were Good Soldiers, and I know you have the new book out now, but the book that I learned was fundamental in sharing the stories that I became very interested in. And then adding to those stories, I started to learn more about Crispus Attucks, Elizabeth Freeman, and our own Loudon soldier like Daniel Coleman. Your book is on my resource list, and I encourage attendees at my programs to buy the books and put them in their libraries. What I like about the book is based on pension records, so we hear the voice through those records, and also the chapters are based on the 13 colonies. So we have people who live in Loudon from all parts of the United States. You can go and look in a particular colony and see if you, or you can learn about Black soldiers that existed during that time. Not all the Black soldiers, but samples of Black soldiers. I have the book, and I hope to get your autograph. To Mr. Greer, it appears you're a master of living history and leading into the stories with your interpretation and costumes of famous Black patriots. Yes, I'm a history nerd. Oops, got it turned over. I'm a history nerd, and I get excited whenever I see interpretive or historical educators, especially at Williamsburg and the Revolutionary Museum in Philadelphia. Let's see. One thing that I have noticed over the last 20 years, all these interpretations are much more inclusive. So therefore, I can go down any block in Williamsburg or around any corner in a museum, and I find someone who looks like me. And that's pretty exciting. I'm learning about Elizabeth Mombet Freeman, who is from Massachusetts, and would like to speak more about her to you and find out if you can refer a period dressmaker. Right now, we're from Amazon. Finally, I'm taking notes, and I hope that we will all are interested in more talks like this. If anyone is interested in hearing more about Black Patriots, join me at the Russ Library on March 30th for another talk, Black Patriots, and Loyalists in the Revolutionary War. The images used are by our local artist, Gertrude Evans, who learned more about the Revolutionary War as she painted. I have flyers in the room on the other side, and more information on the table. And to our speakers, thank you for your talk.
And as Eric makes his way up here, now come up here. One thing I forgot to mention, if we can hold the questions until the end, we'll have a Q&A period after our two speakers are done presenting today. Thanks.
Well, I'm not going to use the microphone. Is that okay? Okay.
Camera.
People tell me I have a loud voice, so okay. So I'm Eric Larson. I'm the Historic Records Manager for the Clerk of the Circuit Court for Loudoun County. We're proud to say that Loudoun County has one of the largest preserved collection of court records in the state of Virginia. Our records date back to the county's founding in 1757. They were saved during the Civil War in February 1862 when the court justices ordered the George K. Fox, who was the county clerk at the time, to move them south to Campbell County, where they survived the war. Because of that, that's why we have so many documents not many documents on the Revolutionary War, but we've got quite a few documents on enslavement and also free blacks in Loudoun County, which we're very proud of. As our Revolutionary War collection, it's somewhat large. We have some pension requests. What they actually are affidavits where you went before the court and asked the court to verify that you are this person so you could turn around and apply to the War Department for your pension. One of the documents we actually have is Daniel Coleman, the only known African-American soldier we actually have in our collection. And that's what that was. In 1820, he asked the court to verify that he was Daniel Coleman. I apologize, I'm sorry. Daniel Coleman, and to apply for his pension at the War Department in 1824. If he got it, we really don't know, and we really don't know what happened to him after he applied for the pension because he was in his 90s. All we know, he was also enlisted in Maryland in 1781. So Alicia is working on that, along with Travis as well, trying to fill in the gaps on those on Daniel Coleman. As well, I'm excited about this talk because we are talking about, of course, Black Patriots. When I worked at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, I actually was an interpreter for the Revolutionary War Continental Soldier, but I also wrote a program and research on the Black Rhode Island Regiment that was raised in 1778. So it's exciting to hear all this. For me, it's like coming home to all of it. We produced a brochure last year on the documents in our court on the Revolutionary War. They follow the Revolutionary War from prior to 1775 up to the last known document that we found in 1859 that actually deals with a soldier event or a visit to Loudoun County by Revolutionary soldiers, and of course Lafayette. Also, we have a Black History brochure that outlines the history of our African Americans at the courthouse. Matter of fact, Lori put most of this brochure together. It came out a few years ago. And we have this one along with a walking map, and all that's on our table in the other room, so you can pick up a packet of this. And you can also view facsimiles of Daniel Coleman's pension request. And I also have a blow-up of it as well. It's a really nice letter, or not letter, but his affidavit where he was enlisted, served, and when he came to Loudoun County. So thank you for having me out here today and having the clerk's historic records out here. I'll turn the program back to Lori.
And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marvin-Alonzo Greer. I am the Director of Historical Interpretation for the Department of Parks and Recreation in Prince George's County, Maryland. My area of expertise is primarily the Civil War, but I dabble in early American history as well up through World War I. And my main interest is the role that Black Americans have played in our country, in the creation of our country, especially during the times of a segregated military. The way that this talk is going to go, you may see me kind of run through some slides because we're going to start with modern day times and work our way backwards to the 18th century to figure out how did we get to where we are today. So one of my favorite quotes is by Noam Chomsky, an American legend. He says, education is not memorizing that Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Education is understanding how millions of ordinary Germans were convinced that it was required. Education is learning how to spot the signs that history's repeating itself. Americans, we don't love history. We actually hate history as a country. It may seem fascinating that you say that. Americans, we actually love nostalgia. There's a reason that we put up statues. There's a reason that we have certain historic sites preserved and not others, because we want to whitewash American history to show what we want the world to see, what we want our country to be, but not actually who we are, because doing the work is hard. It's hard. I'm a person who I don't like to work out. Hence, I don't look like a bodybuilder. America is the exact same way. We don't want to work to do the right thing all the time. And you may say, well, why are you criticizing your country? Well, we're going to use James Baldwin, again, working way backwards. James Baldwin said, I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for that reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. There's nothing more American than this quote right here. I feel the exact same way. I am the descendant of both a patriot from the American Revolution. My ancestor served out of this very state of Virginia in the Virginia militia. His job mainly was probably to round up people who looked like me. I'm also the descendant of James Madison, who did not have any white children, but he had enslaved children. And for that reason, I love my country. I understand that we are a flawed country, but we can do better, and we know we can do better because if we look back through history, we know we have amazing patriots who lived in all different centuries that have paved the way for a more perfect union. And our union is made up kind of like a tree. And Marcus Garvey, the civil rights activist, put it the best. He said, a people without the knowledge of their past history and origin and culture is like a tree without roots. We as Americans, we are a growing tree, but our roots aren't deeply planted in the ground. We don't really understand where we came from because we like this idea of nostalgia. Going back even further, the preacher and veteran of the American Civil War, Elijah Mars, said, "I can stand this," said I. "This is better than slavery. Though I do march in a line at the tap of a drum, I felt freedom in my bones. And when I saw the American flag, the American eagle with the outspread wings upon the American flag, with the motto E pluribus unum, the thought came to me, give me liberty or give me death. Then all fear banished." This man was born enslaved. He's hearkening back to this revolutionary idea. And probably the greatest president we've ever had, Abraham Lincoln, said, "Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer immigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure without the base alloy of hypocrisy." He said that in 1855. Again, hearkening back to our founding values and what our ancestors were dealing with in the 19th century. So our ancestors, many of our ancestors, were there at our nation's founding. Today we hear a lot of people say, America, love it or leave it. If you want to criticize this country, go back to where you came from. Well, as a person who's done a deep dive into my genealogy and a student of World War I wanted to understand, where did Black Americans come from? I know we are a nation of immigrants, but how far back do most of our roots go? Well, looking at the 1910 census, I discovered that over 99% of Black Americans in 1910 were born here in this country. That's very important to note, because there wasn't a large immigration from Africa, from the Caribbean, from other Black nations to this country prior to World War II. So we know that if you're a Black American, even today in the 21st century, and you can trace your ancestry back to at least World War I, probably World War II, the likelihood of your ancestors being here during the Revolution is extremely high, compared to only 60% of white Americans who can trace their ancestry or who say they were born here in the United States. So when you hear people say, don't criticize this country, Americans, love it or leave it, Black Americans have been here a very, very long time. And where do those individuals come from? The vast majority of our ancestors were brought here to the Americas through the largest forced migration in world history. Over 10 million enslaved Africans were brought on slave ships from European vessels, mainly to South and Central America and the Caribbean. A smaller percentage here to what becomes the American colonies, later on the United States. The first enslaved Africans are brought by the Spanish. They travel throughout the southwest, the south and southwest of what becomes the United States. But the first people to really settle in a large settlement would be the 20-and-odd Africans that were brought to Jamestown in 1619. Now, again, today, many people say, well, not many, some politicians are telling us that these were job training programs. Enslaved Africans came here without any kind of skills, and that we needed slavery to teach them. Because that's what history has taught us, because we've erased black history. That's not factually true. And we know that based on the 18th century writings, 19th century writings, and the accomplishments of enslaved people. The image you see here of the Great Barn at historic Staggville in North Carolina was built by enslaved Africans. The enslaver said, I need a barn built, you all need to build it. These people, again, never been to college, they weren't engineers, they weren't architects. But they were people who descended from shipbuilding cultures in Africa. So what do? They built a ship upside down, and that is the barn. Skilled labor. We also know this going back into the 18th century. The Europeans who were buying and selling people knew that they were looking for skilled labor. Today, if you need to go to get your car fixed, you don't go to McDonald's. Why? Because although you could find a mechanic who happens to work at McDonald's, that's not what McDonald's does. They sell fast food. You go to the mechanic. And in the 18th century, enslavers and slave traders were no different. They went to different places than Africa who specialized in different skills. So you see these two ads. One for Windward and Rice Coast Negroes, meaning that's where they produced rice. So if you are living in the Low Country, in South Carolina, Georgia, you're going to want to buy people from that area. The other ad says from the coast of Angola. Today, Angola is just a country. Historically, Angolans were known to be some of the best iron producers in the world. And so they're intentionally saying, we're selling Angolans, so if you need blacksmiths, this is the people that you want to buy. Today, we lost that in translation because this information has been lost. However, our enslaved ancestors may have come over empty-handed, but not empty-headed, and they're passing these skills on generationally. But from the moment they get here, they're resisting. We know that because of writings from enslavers, and laws are only passed when there's something going on. Right here in Virginia in 1680, Virginia passes a law banning enslaved and free black people from owning any kind of weapon for defense or offense, and that included canes. Armed resistance was not the only type of resistance enslaved people are using. They're preserving culture and heritage, songs, dance, music, having family ties, creating last names for themselves when those are trying to be stripped from them, suing from their freedom. There's a whole list of ways that people resisted. And when it comes to the American Revolution, the person we normally think of resisting the most is going to be Crispus Attucks, a formerly enslaved man who self-liberated. He was part of the protests in Boston, protesting the government's actions that they thought were intolerable. He considered himself a patriot, even though the government in which he was protesting was also advocating for him to be still enslaved and returned to slavery. And he gives his life during the protest in Boston, later on known as the Boston Massacre. This adds to the buildup to what becomes known as the American Revolution. Another part of that buildup is a lesser-known court case, the Somerset versus Stewart from 1772. Where an enslaved man from here in the colonies is taken to England by his enslaver. There he self-emancipates, meaning he voted with his feet and ran away. His enslaver tracks him down and says, to punish you, I'm going to put you on a ship and I'm going to sell you to the sugar islands like Jamaica, Barbados. Both black and white abolitionists rally to the cause and get a stay put on this on his deportation and his sale. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And Lord Mansfield, who you see here, rules in the Supreme Court decision in Somerset versus Mansfield that slavery has no place in English law. And he does not abolish slavery in England, but he puts the cracks in that glass ceiling. This does a huge thing. It scares the heck out of enslavers in the colonies. Why? Because if you can end slavery in the motherland, the colonies have no hope. And we know that black enslaved individuals from right here in Virginia are understanding it, and they're fighting back. They understand the politics of the time. They may not be literate, they may not be college educated, but they understand what these legal actions mean. And we can see that in runaway ads for a woman named Suki Jones and a man named John Christian, who both self-liberate based on the Somerset case, and they try to find their freedom. Unfortunately, we don't know what happens to either individual. We hope that they made it onto a ship bound for freedom, but we just don't know. But what we do know is that people resisted. People used the politics of the time to say, I'm going to make a change and find my own liberty. We also know the white reactions to the Somerset case. Edward Long wrote to the Virginia Gazette. He was a planter in the Caribbean, but he writes that slaveholding might perhaps be well discontinued in every province in the North American continent because of this case. Fear. This fear permeates not just the unknown people, but the people we idolize, like George Washington, who asserts that the British will make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. Is that on any of his monuments? He understands that it's an arbitrary way that enslaved people are treated. They know what is going on. And this hypocrisy is not lost on people of the time. So we can say, oh, they're products of their time, they didn't know any better. George Washington knew it was arbitrary, and so did other people, both the enslaved people who were resisting and white abolitionists. Samuel Johnson, a man in England, writes, if slavery be thus fatally contagious, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes? They knew what they were doing. But despite this idea that the American cause may have been hypocritical, there were black Americans who said, I'm going to fight for a country who won't fight for me. I'm going to fight for an idea because I can make a difference in this new formed country. And one of the first people to be wounded at the first battle of the American Revolution was an enslaved man named Prince Estabrook. Prince Estabrook was born in Massachusetts in 1741. He was enslaved by Benjamin Estabrook. And for those of you who don't know, for almost all the colonies, if you were a white man, you had to be part of the colonial militia. The colonial militia was not to put down an oppressive government. The colonial militias were solely to prevent your community from being attacked by Native Americans or enslaved people. End stop. And also, if the French and the Spanish invaded, you would help defend your government. Prince Estabrook not only was part of the militia, he was one of the Minutemen. And there's a difference between the Minutemen and the militia. Everyone had to be all white men had to be part of the militia. The Minutemen were those hardcore guys who were like, we want to drill more, we want to be more equipped. Kind of the hardcore fighters. And Prince Estabrook was one of those Minutemen who served at, now whether this is willingly or unwillingly, we don't know. However, we do know at the Battle of Lexington Green, he is wounded in 1775 on April 19th. He's wounded, but he continues to serve throughout the rest of the conflict. And he sees his last action in 1781. And for his heroic actions, when Massachusetts abolishes slavery, he is manumitted in 1790 and passes away as a free man. He's not alone. Men in Massachusetts like Salem Poor and Peter Salem and dozens of others serve at the Battle of Bunker Hill, even killing a British officer. But freedom is not being promised to these black freedom fighters that are advocating for American independence and protesting, quote unquote, British tyranny. The first signs of freedom would actually wear a red coat. Ironic. Right here in Virginia, our last royal governor, John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, issues a proclamation after he has run out of the colonial capital, Williamsburg. In his proclamation, he has no troops to his defense, and in his proclamation he says that any enslaved man who is enslaved by a rebel, so not everybody because he himself is an enslaver, if you lay down your weapons, if you lay down your tools and come to the British side in the defense of the motherland, then you will become free. This is not a loving thing. He's doing this out of necessity. He has no love necessarily for black people. But he wants to stoke fears in white Virginians. He wants to put down this rebellion, but his proclamation does the exact opposite. It actually stokes and inflames Virginians who were on the fence, but now definitely want to join the rebel side. Dunmore's regiment was called the Ethiopian Regiment. The numbers range in what people debate how many men actually came to Dunmore's cause, but both men, women, and children go. They are pressing the issue, even though his proclamation was only for able-bodied black men. We do know women and children are also going. They're pressing the issue saying, if my husband is going, if my son is going, if my father is going, we're going too. You're either going to take all of us or take none of us. Unfortunately, many of those who join Dunmore's lines die of smallpox and disease. Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment sees combat in 2 locations, the Battle of Great Bridge right here in Virginia and the Battle of St. George Island in Maryland. A newspaper article comes out and says that his men were emblazoned with liberty to slaves on their breasts. Whether that's true or not, and just patriot propaganda, it's probably more like the propaganda aspect than the reality, because this is the only account for that, for them having that motto. But it's still pretty indicative of the fear and also what black men are fighting for. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of writing from black loyalists on why they're fighting and how they feel. But a man named Boston King from South Carolina writes a book after the war. And he has one of the most beautiful lines, I think, of the American Revolution, saying, "I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English. They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before." Liberty, freedom, wearing the red coat. Now, that next year, July 4th, 1776, what happens? America issues the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. These beautiful words are masking the realities of what the people who penned these words, who signed these documents, were actually practicing, what they believed. The right to enslave people's bodies, their labor. And we know that black loyalists saw this. Men like a man named Titus, who later on became known as Colonel Ty, self-emancipates, votes with his feet, and joins the British lines. He joins a loyalist militia unit, later on calling men to his own banner and leading a group of British loyalists, both black and white men, getting the nickname Colonel Ty. He had no actual official military rank. At the Battle of Monmouth, he actually captures a militia captain for the Patriots. Unfortunately, Colonel Ty is wounded, shot in the hand at a battle, and he dies. We talked about being skilled labor. Black loyalists are using those skills that they have under enslavement that their ancestors passed on to them to also use those in British lines. We know this because right here in Virginia, we have Kane, Ratcliffe, and Pompey. All three men joined Tarleton's Legion. Bannister Tarleton was the commander of the American Legion, mainly in South Carolina and Virginia. Those were American loyalists, both black and white, but primarily white loyalists. But his black loyalist contingent would also join him. We can see in this runaway ad that Radcliffe used to train for racing. So he's familiar with horse racing and how to tend to horses. And Pompey was brought up or grew up under a blacksmith. These are all skills that can be used by the military. The British go even further. In 1779, when General Sir Henry Clinton issues his proclamation from Phillipsburg, New York, known as the Phillipsburg Proclamation. This extended Lord Dunmore's proclamation beyond just men of military age. This said that any enslaved person, man, woman, or child, old or young, who made it to English lines would be offered their freedom, as long as they were enslaved by a rebel. And we know that black women are now pressing this even more. They were doing this before, but now the floodgates are starting to open up even more, because now there's legal ramifications for their self-liberation. This young lady, just 18 years old, named Dinah, liberates herself and goes off with Cornwallis's army. I can only imagine what the fear must have been like, the apprehension, to be a young girl of 18 years old, to go off with a foreign army, with a group of men who you don't know. Protecting women's bodies today in the 21st century is difficult. You can imagine if you're enslaved, you're not viewed as a whole person. You have no personhood in the eyes of the law. But you're saying, I would risk that over one more day enslavement. Give me liberty or give me death. Dinah is a hero. And these aren't just people coming from dire situations like Dinah. Eve, a woman enslaved by Peyton and Betty Randolph. Peyton Randolph was the first and second president of the Continental Congress. He was the former Speaker of the House of Burgesses right here in Virginia. He passes away before the revolution really gets started in 1775. But his enslaved waiting woman, Eve, self-liberates. This woman would have most likely been living in the big house, had access to better clothing, better food, but she opts to take her young son and quote unquote go to the enemy. And Betty Randolph has her nephew put out a runaway ad for her. And we know that Eve went to Yorktown and was there at the surrender. But freedom is not only being sought in the British lines. We know that some enslaved people are opting to use the Continental forces as their way of self-liberation. A young man named Henry self-liberates, and he tells people that he's going to be a soldier in the army. His enslaver is considered a patriot, someone who's loyal to his rebel government, but he's saying, you know what, you're practicing enslavement, I'm going to practice freedom, because we're saying that all men are created equal, And I believe in this new country. I know we can do better. And if I fight, you're going to see me as a whole person. He's joined by another man named Jacob, just a couple years older, who went off to enlist in the Pennsylvania line. But while these men are enlisting, payment for Continental soldiers is an issue. We're a fledgling government. Our money is really not backed by very much. Hopes and dreams. And so the Continental Congress is debating, how do we pay our soldiers? Well, the father of the U.S. military, Major General von Steuben, writes to Washington one of his possible solutions for paying soldiers. And it's in human flesh. He proposes that we give land and a black person, enslaved person, to pay the Continental soldiers. The colony of South Carolina also does the exact same thing. They advocate for paying people in human flesh. Despite this, we know that black men in the hundreds are serving in the Continental line. Right here at Yorktown, both free and enslaved men joined the Rhode Island Regiment. It was an integrated unit of black men, white men, Native Americans. And they served at Yorktown. We know what they looked like based on the Diverger image right here. I'm sure John will talk more about them in his talk. But freedom was really in sight on the waters. We don't talk a lot about it, but black men were serving in larger capacities on the waters on both the Loyalist side and the Patriot side than they were here on the ground. Two men I want to mention is Thomas Jeremiah, a Loyalist from South Carolina. He was a pilot on a ship, so he was navigating the waterways. He was known for having Loyalist sympathies. Because of that, he was accused by the Patriot government in South Carolina of sedition. He declared his innocence. Without evidence, they convicted him, and he was hanged for treason. James Fortin, on the other hand, a Loyalist from Philadelphia, worked on a privateer ship. He survives the war and afterwards becomes a leader of the abolitionist movement. And his family does immense work fighting for equal justice for all Americans. But in 1783, the guns fall silent. England and these rebel colonies that would become the United States sue for peace. What does that mean for both the Black Patriots and the Black Loyalist? We talked about Eve, who was enslaved by Peyton and Betty Randolph. Well, she is captured and returned to Betty Randolph, who writes an amendment or a codicil to her will, saying, "Whereas Eve's bad behavior laid me under necessity of selling her." What bad behavior was that? That bad behavior was seeking freedom. She self-liberated to find her own freedom. The same thing that Betty Randolph and her late husband Peyton, were fighting for. The same liberty and freedom that Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and George Washington were fighting for. Eve is saying, I'm really fighting for that freedom, freedom of body, not just freedom in theory to make my own economic choices. But for losing, she is sold. Boston King writes about what the experience was like witnessing enslavers coming into New York after the British surrender. Enslavers dragging these freedom seekers, these black loyalists, out of their bed to take them back to Virginia and North Carolina and other places in the former colonies. Some black loyalists are able to get their freedom. Many were listed on the Book of Negroes. That was a ledger that was kept by the British government, listing out the names of enslaved people, or formerly enslaved people, listing out where they were from, who their enslavers were, and where they were going. About 5,000 black loyalists, black refugees are relocated to Canada, to England, to Germany, Belgium, Sierra Leone, and the like. Actually, before we get back to that, not all were allowed to leave. There was no wholesale program the British had. It was pretty disorganized. When the British were evacuating Charleston, South Carolina, they cut the pontoon boats to prevent black loyalists from going with them. These freedom seekers start jumping into the water to swim to the boats. British soldiers pull out swords and hatchets and start hacking away at their hands so they couldn't swamp the boats and get to freedom. So these promises are broken. We know that enslaved black loyalists, patriots, like Tom Evans, who's from Augusta County, Virginia, did not get his freedom after the war, but still had that pride in country. And every year, he would dress up in his old uniform from the war and parade through the streets. This account from one of his neighbors said he owned a suit of ancient uniform, cocked hat, coat, and genuine 76 pattern, red short breeches, in which he often equipped himself on the 4th of July and paraded the streets. He was proud of serving his country, even though his country would not acknowledge him. William Grimes, the son of who was formerly enslaved, who liberated himself, the son of a Revolutionary War veteran, encapsulates the experiences of black Americans, both loyalist and patriot, in his book. He says, "If it were not for the stripes in my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would, in my will, leave my skin a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and then bind the Constitution of a glorious, happy, and free America. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of American liberty." So despite what side someone fought on, whether they were a black loyalist or a black patriot, the politics really didn't matter. It was about who was going to offer me the best chance of freedom. It wasn't about taxation without representation. It's not about land ownership and shipping rights. This is which side is going to uphold this bargain of all men being created equal. Which side is going to get me my freedom and my family's freedom and the freedom for all people in the Americas first. And so as you guys go about today, I want you to think about that. Think past the politics, think past the economics, but what does freedom mean to you? There's a word called Sankofa, S-A-N-K-O-F-A. It comes from the Akan and the Twi language of the modern-day country of Ghana. It goes back hundreds of thousands of years. It means go back and retrieve your history so you can progress forward. History is not something we just look at and say it's nice on a shelf. The clothing is cool. This is a nice old house. This gun is cool. But why does history matter? What can we learn about it that can make a better future for the generations to come? Because then, and only then, we can answer these two important questions. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? What's your legacy going to be? And I know we have some young kids here. What future and what examples do we want to leave for them? The American Revolution we can learn a lot from. We're not responsible for the sins of our past, but we are responsible for fixing those sins and creating a more perfect union. With that, I thank you all for coming out today. So this book right here, the original textbook that if you went to school for, you probably learned this 50s, 60s, probably 70s. You probably learned from this book. It's your textbook that you wrote?
The picture, you're going to show the picture.
Because John is about to, oh,
You're good. Sorry, I'm going to mess up your...
very good. Because John's about to start. But this book talks about slavery being happy and prosperous. And so we think about why we do the things we do, why some people think the way they think. It's because we've had generations of Americans who've been undereducated and miseducated. So if people are like, well, I don't understand why you're trying to change history and make history woke now, it's because you're challenging someone to think your preacher lied to you, your teachers lied to you, your grandparents lied to you, your parents lied to you, so it's easier to say that you are the liar, not all these people that have been miseducated in the past. And so since we've had a history of not telling history historically, Lori talked about telling the full story, and now when you start to introduce different complex parts of history, unfortunately people can't handle that because it dispels the myths of their entire worldview. But with that being said, I'm gonna turn over to my friend John.
Awesome.
Good job, thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here today, and it's a real pleasure to jointly present with Marvin-Alonzo. This is a grand occasion.
It's for you later.
Just a little bit about me and how I got started in this. I took college courses. I never got a degree. I still don't have a degree. I'm basically a self-taught historian with some very good mentors. I read a lot when I was a kid. You know, when I first wrote, I basically remember the writing that I had read and basically modeled my writing on that. But I grew over the years. I mean, I started in 1984. I just joined a living history unit, a reenacting unit. I couldn't get answers to a lot of my questions, and luckily I lived only 15 minutes away from the David Library of the American Revolution, just near Washington's Crossing, Pennsylvania. That's since moved to into Philadelphia. So I was lucky that way. I eventually went to other research institutions, but so right as of now, I've been writing almost 40 years. Until 2019, I hadn't written a book, but I have written over 200 articles on the period, mostly from the point of view of common men and women with the armies and what they would have experienced and the things they would have worked with. So, I mean, I believe in what I do, and with my two books, I definitely believe in those subjects and really hope to get more people to understand them. So we begin. I want to read a quote by Ursula K. Le Guin just to start us off. Get my eyes on here. I noticed Marvin didn't have to use his second eyes. There is a great river, and it flows through this land, and we have named it history. In a relatively short time, I hope to give some idea of African Americans serving as Continental Army soldiers. Along the way, I'll share the stories of several individuals, take a look at how soldiers of color were treated, and tie it all together with some insights into their numbers. I'll also read a portion of the only known still existing letter written by a black revolutionary soldier to his wife. One of the earliest mentions I uncovered on Continental Army black soldiers was in a memoir by 5th Massachusetts white revolutionary veteran Henry Hallowell. He gave the simple but fitting tribute to the men of African descent he served with. He noted, "In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Palm Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers. Looking into those veterans' military records, I found that Jephthah Ward had served 5 years, 1779 to 1783. Job Upton enlisted in May 1777 and was discharged after 1 year, while Douglas Middleton served 3 years, beginning in April 1777. Palm Simmons served 6 years, beginning in April 1777. Enlisting 19 March 1778 for 3 years and enlisting in 1781 for the war. Simmons went to Virginia in 1781 under the Marquis de Lafayette, serving in that hard-marching summer campaign against Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis's army that precipitated the British surrender at Yorktown. That single reference and those brief service records, plus my reading of Benjamin Quarles's excellent 1961 book, The Negro in the American Revolution, and I still highly recommend it, pushed me to learn more about the men of color who fought in our founding war. Now, before I go into my main portion of my talk, I wanted to mention the segregated regiments of color that served in the War of the Revolution. So that's next slide. There we go. Segregated regiments and smaller units were formed by several nations during the war, but they were not the norm. They do, however, serve as a counterpoint to practices in the Continental Army and state militias, 1775 to 1783. Representing 4 armies, here they are. The earliest was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed by Crown Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore in 1775, with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia. Also known as Dunmore's Black Regiment, that unit was involved in the November 15 action at Kemp's Landing near Norfolk, and then 24 days later in the Great Bridge Battle, where British and Loyalist forces were defeated. Decimated by smallpox in June 1776, Lord Dunmore wrote, "Had it not been for this horrid disorder, I would have had 2,000 blacks. Roughly 300 black men, women, and children remained when that unit was disbanded in September 1776, and of those, only 150 were soldiers." 6 months later, in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe directed that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who had been admitted into the Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. In essence, this meant that armed blacks were barred from serving in Crown-established Loyalist regiments. And I say Crown-established Loyalist regiments because there was Loyalist militia and there were Loyalist irregular units. And actually, Colonel Ty actually fought in basically a Loyalist irregular unit. In March 1779, France formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment consisted of free men of color, with blacks and mulattoes separated into their own companies, reflecting the colorism rife in Saint-Domingue society. The Chasseurs Volunteers' white commander, Colonel Rouvet, was proud of his men who joined without enlistment bonuses. The colonel asked for the abolishment of humiliating and degrading distinctions that had been heaped upon them and wished that his men's creed would be, quote, "I must make the whites blush for the scorn they have heaped upon me in my civil status and for the injustices and tyrannies that they have continually exercised over me with impunity. I must prove to them that as a soldier, I am capable of at least as much honor and courage, of even more loyalty." Their only large-scale action was at the siege of British-held Savannah in autumn 1779. Most of the unit was disbanded in early 1780, but one element served until 1784 on the West Indian island of Grenada. Next, Spain. The Havana battalions of free blacks and mulattoes, segregated by color, were first formed in Cuba in 1762, previously having only operated by companies. Men of color joining these units enjoyed a rise in societal status, plus special benefits for themselves and their families. Picked detachments served in ad hoc grenadier and light battalions during the 1781 operations to take Pensacola, Florida, where they fought well. They remained in high esteem well into the 19th century, and in 1795, one of the most severe detractors felt compelled to state that they were, without a doubt, some of the best soldiers in the world. Now, contrary to those examples, most of the Continental Army was thoroughly and constantly integrated from the first day of the conflicts to its last, while British regiments had only black musicians, servants, and laborers, and most loyalist units followed suit. That said, there was a single segregated Continental Army regiment manned by private soldiers of black and Indian heritage, commanded by white officers, sergeants, and corporals. That unit was the so-called Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment. In time, it became the corps most often associated with African American Revolutionary soldiers. And although the unit was an outlier in a largely integrated army, it saw hard service and has an intriguing, though much mythologized history. As such, it should be discussed in some detail. Little is known of African American numbers in the early war Rhode Island military establishment. In 1775, Massachusetts General William Heath noted, The regiments of Rhode Island have a number of Negroes and Indians. All the Rhode Island regiments from 1775 through 1777 contain soldiers of color serving alongside their white comrades. With the Continental Army's 1777 rebirth, only the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments remained, recruited with men enlisted or re-enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. Next one. On October 22, 1777, the 2 Rhode Island regiments, supported by artillery, successfully defended Fort Mercer in New Jersey against a brigade of Hessian troops. 5 days after the battle, both regiments numbered 369 non-commissioned officers, musicians, and privates. Of those fighting in Fort Mercer, 48, 12.6%, were soldiers of color, including 39 African Americans, 10% of the whole, 7 Native Americans, almost 2%, and 2 mixed African Indians, about 0.5%. The Rhode Island regiments were particularly hard hit during the 1777 campaign, and the state had to consider how to recruit them. General James Varnum recommended in January 1778 that a battalion of Negroes be raised in Rhode Island. That February, the state legislature resolved that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the war. So it was eventually determined that those recruits would only join the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that unit would be filled with freed slaves, free blacks and Indians, as well as veteran black and Indian soldiers, all under the charge of white commanders. Next one. Governor Nicholas Cook noted in late February, the number of slaves in this state is not great, but it is generally thought that 300 and upwards will be enlisted. Any slaves accepted received their freedoms and their owners remunerated. Unpopular with many residents, in early May, the legislature set a June 10, 1778 cutoff date for slave recruiting, though free blacks and Indians could continue to enlist. Despite Governor Cook's assurances, less than 190 African Americans ever joined the 1st Regiment and was never able to form a full battalion for service with General George Washington's main army. While the 1st Rhode Island command staff was recruiting slaves in their home state, the regiment's white enlisted personnel remaining at Valley Forge were incorporated into the 2nd Regiment. At the same time, the veteran black and Indian soldiers, also remaining at Valley Forge, from both regiments, were formed into a single segregated company under Captain Thomas Arnold. Arnold's 60-strong company belonged to the absent 1st Regiment, but with the main army fielded with Colonel Israel Angle's 2nd Rhode Island. When Washington's forces confronted the British at the June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Captain Arnold's Black Company marched to Monmouth Courthouse with Varnum's brigade and Major General Charles Lee's advance force. Next. Oh, I think we're one behind. Next one. There we are. About midday during the battle, having earlier attacked the British rearguard, Lee's men retreated in the face of superior forces, withdrawing towards General Washington's marching troops. Meeting the advancing main army, General Lee encountered Washington, who placed Lee in charge of an ad hoc holding action. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney described the Rhode Island troops during the ensuing defense. After retiring something more than a mile, Varnum's brigade, including the Rhode Islanders, were ordered to halt and form by a cross fence to cover 2 pieces of artillery which were in danger of being lost. With air exchanged about 10 rounds, and were then obliged to retire with considerable loss, but not until the enemy had outflanked us and advanced with charged bayonets to the fence by which we had formed. Our brigade suffered more than any that was engaged. The enemy did not pursue us far in our retreat, observing our army formed on the heights in our rear. And you can still go to that spot and find it pretty easily on the Battle of Monmouth. There's a noticeable knoll behind the hedge fence there. Captain Arnold's leg was amputated as a result of his wound in that action, and one of Arnold's men, Richard Rhodes, related in the 19th century. He's very much crippled in one arm in consequence of a wound received in the Battle of Monmouth. He was born in Africa, brought to this country, and sold as a slave, and enlisted in the Black Regiment to obtain his freedom. Arnold's company joined the 1st Rhode Island Regiment in July 1778. That regiment went on to see combat at the August 1778 Battle of Rhode Island and remained in their home state until marching to New York in early 1781. Thus, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment existed as such only from March 1778 to June 1780, 2 years and 3 months. During that same period, the 2nd Rhode Island was also segregated, but white. The Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment was never large enough to form a full regiment, and because of that, never served with Washington's main army until 1781, when its remaining 2 companies were consolidated with the 2nd Rhode Island to form a single Rhode Island regiment. So let's look briefly at the Rhode Island soldier of color numbers from 1777 to 1781. As we saw at the October 22, 1777 defense of Fort Mercer, the integrated 1st and 2nd regiments combined had 48 soldiers of color, and black soldiers themselves comprised 10.6% of the two units' total strength. In August 1778, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment contained 188 black soldiers, plus 5 Indians and 4 mixed African to Indian. By September 1779, the 1st Rhode Island only had 147 soldiers, and by June 1780, only 124 black and Indian soldiers remained. Those men were formed into 2 large companies and attached to an understrength late state 6-month levy battalion. Early in 1781, those 2 companies were joined with the men of the 2nd Regiment to form the Rhode Island Regiment. That September, just prior to the Yorktown siege, those companies had 7 white companies and 2 mixed black and Indian companies combined. Those 2 companies numbered 108 privates. Adding black musicians and men on other duty at that time, soldiers of color comprised 31% of the Rhode Island Regiment. And to repeat, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment was an outlier, an experiment born of necessity in an army of integrated units. That experiment was largely unsuccessful, but through no fault of its own. The fact that the regiment remained seriously understrength for the entire term of its existence was largely due to the legislature cutting off slave enlistment only 4 months after it was begun. Still, in the 19th century, the black regiment became a symbol, an example of African-American ability as soldiers, and was seen by many as a precursor of the United States colored regiments and later segregated American regiments that served from the 1860 Civil War into the mid-20th century. So let's now turn and look at the rest of the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were made public in 1776, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans had been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army, Navy, and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. Black soldiers' motivation for joining the Continental Army and their treatment while serving are as important to any discussion of their military experience. The reasons somewhat mirrored those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers. Some fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in a new republic. Some joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family and friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. Some joined as paid substitutes in the place of those who could afford the fee. And after the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, some men fought for their own freedom or for that of their loved ones. Forced service was another matter. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental Regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return for military service. Most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage after their discharge. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 95% of the country's people of African descent and relegated blacks to underclass status. In light of their treatment in civilian society, one remarkable result of researching black Continental soldiers is finding that they largely received the same considerations as their white comrades. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. Both whites and soldiers of color suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. The most glaring case of unequal treatment was that black soldiers were, with very few exceptions, barred from serving in any rank other than drummer, fifer, or private soldier. There were other inequities. Early in the war, Africans were occasionally singled out for labor details, but that ended by 1778. There are also indications that black enlisted men served as officer servants more often than white soldiers, but that remains unsubstantiated. Finally, while there were likely difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus, to date, no such instances have come to light. So let's turn to an overview of early service. As Marvin-Alonzo noted, black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside the white comrades from Lexington to Concord and back to Boston on April 19, 1775. To date, we have the names of 35 black men present that day, at least 18 seeing combat. One, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green. It is likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were enlisted in militia on that war's first day. And I must note that black musket-bearing soldiers, Continentals, and militia went on to fight in every major battle of the war and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. 2 months later, at least 88 black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served at the 17 June Bunker Hill battle. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, roughly 5% of American troops involved. There are several mentions of black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite, speaking to the courage and resilience of African American soldiers and the effect one man's determination had on another. John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons bearing the wounded and dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of the neck, passed me, and his collar being open and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers, I saw the wound quite plainly and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much. He said no, that it was only going to get a plaster put on it and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war." Despite that proven ability, early on some considered African Americans unfit for service. At first, enslaved men were barred from enlisting. In July 1775, Adjutant General Horatio Gates issued recruiting instructions to regimental officers. You are not to enlist any deserter from the ministerial army, nor any stroller, Negro, meaning enslaved man, or vagabond, or person suspected of being an enemy to the liberty of America, nor any under 18 years of age. 2 months later, New Jersey Congressman Richard Smith noted, Tuesday, 26 September, the committee brought in a letter to General Washington. In the course of it, South Carolinian Edward Rutledge moved that the general shall discharge all the Negroes, as well slaves as freemen, in his army. He, Rutledge, was strongly supported by many of the Southern delegates, but so powerfully opposed that he lost the point. In the next passages, the term Negro is also used to denote all blacks. By contrast, in October 1775, Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether, while November 12 Army orders directed neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. Signaling a change of policy at the end of December, General George Washington told of numbers of free Negroes who are desirous of enlisting, and with Congress's permission, he gave leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. Now, as a side note, during this entire eight-month paper exercise, African Americans were never evicted from the Army. They continued serving during that whole time. There may have been some enslaved men taken out of the Army, but we don't even know that for sure. Given the desperate need to fill Continental regiments, General Washington's February 21, 1776 recruiting instructions stated that officers were expressly forbid enlisting any boys, old men, or slaves, with no mention of barring free blacks. Eventually, individual states began allowing enslaved soldiers as well, and by 1778, they formed a sizable minority in Washington's army. Next one, please. A number of observers noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably, and with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General William Heath replied, "There are in the Massachusetts regiments some few lads and old men, and in several regiments some Negroes." And I have to say here that Adams is actually toning down the number of black men in these regiments. I think he's doing it purposely. Such is also the case with the regiments from the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Negroes and Indians. Connecticut has fewer Negroes but a number of Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both. The men from Connecticut, I think, in general, are rather stouter than those of either of the other colonies, but the troops of our colony are robust, agile, and as fine fellows in general as I would ever wish to see in the field. General John Thomas was more emphatic. In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men, but for fatigue and inaction, many of them have proved themselves brave. Europeans were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence, you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them. And I have to note that this statement refers to masters enlisting their enslaved men into military service in place of themselves. And Baron Ludwig von Clossen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, "I had a chance to see the American army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible the soldiers are composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." As for numbers, Clossen claimed, a quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy. Now, regarding his estimate of numbers, my research indicates that it was probably closer to 15% in 1781, which is still a relatively high percentage. Next one. So now we're going to look a little bit more into numbers. At the onset of the War for American Independence, approximately 480,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom roughly 24,000 were free, meaning some 456,000, 95%, were enslaved. Total American population at the time was approximately 2.5 million. Using these numbers, free blacks comprised less than 1% of the overall population, and slaves formed 18%. By comparison, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. In August 1778, a document entitled "A Return of the Negroes in the Army" tallied the number of black men in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. Long thought to enumerate all the men of African descent in those brigades, we now know it reveals the number of enslaved soldiers in those forces. A careful and in-depth study by historian Matthew C. White has shown that in mid to late 18th century official legal papers, and often in other texts, the term Negro alluded to enslaved people. Thus, that roster shows there were 755 slave soldiers in Washington's army that month. In a force totaling almost 21,000 rank and file, corporals, music, and private soldiers, they comprised 3.6% of the whole. By themselves, enslaved soldiers could form 2 understrength regiments, each equal to or larger than most other serving Continental regiments. Now, we have no idea how many free blacks were serving at that time, but they may have been on a par. They may have actually been fewer. We just don't know. But if they were on a par, then 7.2% of that force comprised free and enslaved men. Next one. Here then are the 6 brigades reporting the highest proportions of enslaved soldiers in the August 1778 return. As you can see, 3 are from New England and 3 from southern states, and North Carolina ranks 4th. And also, as you can see, the brigade percentages are all higher than the 15 brigade percentage of 3.6%. And using these numbers, another slide, please. There we go. And using these numbers, we can calculate the average number of enslaved soldiers per regiment within each brigade. With this criteria, North Carolina moves up to 2nd. So you can see that Parsons, Connecticut has the highest at 37 enslaved soldiers, again, not including free blacks. And North Carolina has 29 enslaved soldiers per regiment. Next slide, please. So here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's additional regiment in 1779. It's a good representation of how many Continental regiments would have appeared, with some having a few more black soldiers and others none at all. As seen in our discussion of the 1778 Army return, the proportion of African American soldiers was relatively small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into the mid-19th century. And more importantly, foreign observers and others likely consider African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement, almost on a par with taking up arms against the King's Army and independence from Britain. It may have been an unintentional and to some an unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic arming of blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. Next, please. From numbers, let's turn to 2 individual soldier stories. These come from veterans' 19th century pension narratives, which historian John C. Dan called one of the largest oral history projects ever undertaken. Jacob Francis was born in New Jersey and eventually served in the Massachusetts Continental Regiment for 1 year and then in the New Jersey Militia from 1777 to the war's end. Francis was born in January 1754 and testified, When I was of age, I was bound as an indenture servant by my mother, a colored woman, to one Henry Wambow in Amwell. His indenture was sold to 3 other masters and eventually, at a little over 13 years of age, to Joseph Saxton, who took him from New York to an island in the Caribbean and then to Salem, Massachusetts, where his contract was sold one more time. In January 1775, his contract ended, having served his master for, according to Francis, 6 years until I was 21 years of age. Still living in Salem, Jacob Francis enlisted in autumn 1775 for 1 year in Colonel Paul Sargent's 16th Continental Regiment belonging to Massachusetts. During that term, he served at the Boston Siege and witnessed the battles of Long Island and White Plains. A short time after the fall of Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, Francis and his comrades marched across New Jersey, crossed the river into Pennsylvania, and then marched down to a camp off from the Delaware River a few miles below Corriell's Ferry and above Howe's Ferry, where we lay there a week or two. And that spot's actually about 20 minutes from my house. In his pension application, Jacob quite accurately described the December 26, 1776 attack on the Hessians at Trenton. He wrote, "We received our orders to march and Christmas night crossed at the Delaware. Flew down to Trenton early in the morning. We entered the west end of the town and General Washington came in to the north end. We marched down the street from the river road into the town. General Washington was at the head of that street coming down towards us, and some of the Hessians were between us. There we had the fight. After about a half an hour, the firing ceased. General Lord Sterling, an American general, rode up to Colonel Sargent, and we followed him down through the town towards the Assunpink Creek and crossed to the north side of the Assunpink, where we were formed in line in view of the Hessians, who were paraded on the south side. Being hemmed in, the Hessians surrendered, grounded their arms, and marched down to the old ferry below the Assunpink, where they were ferried over to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware." Jacob Francis soon ended his Continental Army career, being discharged at Trenton soon after the battle. The remainder of Francis's lengthy deposition recounts his militia service. Too long to recount here. He did state, "I always went out when it came my turn to the end of the war." Next one, please. Of all the black Virginia Continentals I found, Andrew Pebbles had perhaps the most varied career. In his pension testimony, Pebbles noted he didn't recall the year he enlisted, being a poor, unlearned mulatto. According to his military records, it was September 15, 1777. He testified that he joined the camp at Valley Forge and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery under Captain William Miller, 1st Continental Artillery Regiment, who commanded the gun with 12 men, to which he belonged. He served 2 years under Captain Michael Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lee, father of Robert E. Lee, whose command was composed of infantry and cavalry and called Lee's Legion. He was in 3 general actions, at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and at Eutaw Springs. At Eutaw Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder slightly, lost the thumb of his left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was discharged on the Combahee River, South Carolina, honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in a battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed, and that was on August 27, 1782. Pebbles, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. In his pension, he testified, "By occupation, I'm a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I am not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years. Next, please. Several other Southern veterans told of enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century. Augmenting those on screen, in 1789, New Jersey veteran Jacob Francis struck another small blow for freedom. Former slave Phyllis Duncan testified she was present and saw Mary Francis married to Jacob Francis by Cato Finley. At the time of said marriage, Phyllis and Mary Francis and Cato Finley all lived with and were the slaves of Nathaniel Hunt, where the marriage took place. Jacob Francis, immediately after his marriage, bought Mary from her master. Mary, in a few days, left the employ of Hunt and went with her husband. And since that time, lived together as a man and wife up until the death of Jacob, and raised a family of children. Next, please. I now want to speak relatively briefly about the African-American women who, by their own free will or the will of others, served with the Army. To correct the popular idea of Army women, black and white, they were, by and large, respectable and respected. Any women who were not long tolerated. I've discovered a number of black women with the Army, some of them servants, and one of those was Hannah Till, who served in General Washington's military household and gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. Another was Sarah, a slave who emancipated herself and her husband and her son and joined the 1st Maryland Regiment for several months in 1778. And a friend of mine actually did this illustration for my first book, so we can actually get some idea what they look like. Next one, please. But I want to focus on one woman, Judith Lines, and read a portion of a letter written to her by her husband, published for the first time in my first book. And before I go on, I must say that there are 2 other known letters from Continental Army black soldiers, one of them enslaved, the other a freedman. Both men could not write and dictated their missives to someone else. Those letters were not sent to family. One letter was written to the slave soldier's master, while the other was to the soldier's former owners. To preface the Lines letter, John Lines enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts. By Judith Lines' own testimony, they married in July 1781. She recalled, "The next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months." Mrs. Lines noted in a pension application, "My husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, which I give to the magistrate who takes this by deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband." So now, the letter. I take this opportunity to send you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you have lived this summer and whether the house is done and whether you've killed that cow or whether you have gotten another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk to you with my dear wife as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lines. Mrs. Lines' letter, or Mr. Lines' letter, was not only tells of his own circumstances, but of Judith's too. On her own, she was raising 3 children, the youngest about 4 years old. Judith was also running a small landholding, possibly by herself or with the help of relatives or a hired hand. We just don't know. Next, please. We also don't know if she took her children to camp in 1782 or left them behind, but by her own testimony, Judith had smallpox while with the Army, a deadly and disfiguring disease that most soldiers have been inoculated against. And here we see on the left the effects of unvaccinated smallpox, which, if the patient survived, would likely leave scars all over the sufferer's face and body. Next, please. Now this chart, I actually, it's not my second book, but I formulated it from my research on that book. It basically shows inclusion and exclusion and segregation in the armies that fought in North America from 1754 all the way to 1865. If anybody wants a copy of this, I can send it to you. Black men, Americans and others, were indeed good soldiers and citizens, even when faced with the growth of racism beginning in the late 19th century. Racial animosity was reflected in the military too, beginning with integration and inclusion in most French and Indian War American provincial units and in continental forces and state militias during the War of the Revolution. The exclusion of black men in the Army first took hold in the 1790s, though not by government statute. By 1802, integration was back, with support or lack thereof already split between North and South. The ban on black soldiers in federal and state regiments is tied to the ascent of Southern commanders before, but especially after, the War of 1812. Towards the end of that conflict, with James Monroe as Secretary of War and men such as South Carolinian General George Izard in high command and Virginian Winfield Scott, a rising star, there seems to have been a sub-Rosa movement to cull black men from the Army. Oddly enough, one piece of evidence from the War of 1812 was included in a private soldier's enlistment record, where Colonel and North Carolinian Henry Atkinson noted, "Discharged under an order from the War Department directing all soldiers of color should be discharged." That can be paired with Major General Izard's July 1814 letter to Secretary of War John Armstrong concerning newly arrived black recruits in 1814. Izard posed a quasi-question, noting that there was some years ago a regulation of our service prohibiting the enlistment of blacks and people of color. he refers back to the 1790s. I have not heard of it being enforced. In 1817, President Monroe appointed South Carolinian John C. Calhoun as Secretary of War, a position he occupied until 1825. Calhoun had a profound impact on the United States Army, including a comprehensive reorganization and the creation of the West Point Military Academy. Concurrent with the Missouri Compromise, Calhoun implemented a ban on black soldiers, not via federal law, but in a mundane February 8, 1820 Army order regarding recruiting. Issued by the Adjutant and Inspector General's Office, it directed, no Negro or mulatto will be received as a recruit of the Army. Following that, Winfield Scott's 1821 regulations for the Army restricted enlistment to all free white male persons. That explains why black men were barred from serving in federal regiments in the 1840s war with Mexico, and in part why segregated regiments became the norm from the American Civil War to the mid-20th century. Another, please. For many black veterans, service in the War of the Revolution was a mark of pride. The first Revolutionary War pension legislation was enacted in 1818. The ensuing acts required the veterans show they were in need in order to be awarded a pension. In July 1820, Artillo Freeman submitted a tally of his belongings. With no real estate or fixed income, Freeman noted, he has no trade, but picks oakum for a living when he's able to work. Mr. Freeman's possessions included bed and beddings, 4 chairs, crockery, pots, kettles, pans, 1 coat, 3 shirts, 1 chest and trunk, his wife and child's clothes, a small quantity of personal apparel, and 1 pig, all worth $15.75. At the end of the list, he added 1 more item. Revolutionary uniform, invaluable. Now, several more things before I yield the floor. Please, next, please. I'm used to giving away stuff for free. I mean, my first book was 2019, so before that and even up to now, I give things away for free. These are pretty large monographs on those different units and organizations. I actually wanted to include them in my second book, but they needed to cut the book, so I cut them out and just included smaller coverings of the same regiments, or most of the same regiments. And all except for the one about the Hessians, black men in Hessians regiments, is in the book, in a condensed version. But you can access these for free. I have cards outside. You have my email on them if you're interested in any of these articles. I can send them to you. Next, please. And this is my article specifically on black men. Well, actually, on the top of the complete list of my work. I cover women with the Army. Cover what soldiers ate and the women ate, what they carried, wagons and watercraft, some battle and campaign studies. And then there's a collection of articles on African Americans serving in the armies of revolution. And then on the bottom are all the ones that I've written on black women with the Army. Next, please. And this is the cover of my first book with the contents. And last. And this is a new book. And I felt compelled for a lot of reasons, but because I've been reading books by Marcus Rediker, and if you haven't read his books, they're quite wonderful. He writes about slavery. He writes about slave ships. The book one in particular was The Many-Headed Hydra. That's what really influenced me, and that influenced me to include a chapter on slavery as the first chapter in the book, because without the enslavement of black people by England and the English colonies, there would have never been the large number of African Americans that we have in the country today, and I've never would have. They formed the foundation for the subject of this book too, and that should be about it.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Sure.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
So, do we have questions for Marvin-Alonzo and John?
Oh, so used to stepping off to the side.
Let me get out of the way. Yeah.
So one of the passages you read said,
no lads or old men in the ranks.
Yeah.
Do we know roundabout what those ages would have been?
Militia service was from about 60 to 50. Sometimes it was a little bit higher. And basically, lads and old men, they would have been talking about. I mean, even some young men of 16 would not have been able to serve in the army and carry a musket and march, 10, 15, 20 miles a day. Same thing with, I mean, there are records of older men serving in the army. Not many, but some in their 60s, and even a couple in their early 70s that served in the army. They were they weren't the rule for sure.
Tell us a little bit about James Fortin.
You want to go or should I? Okay, cool. Yeah. James Fortin is an amazing person. He's Revolutionary veterans, by and large, especially common soldiers, even some officers, but especially common soldiers, white or black or Indian, a lot of them had a hard time after the war. They had just spent 2, 3, sometimes 8 years of the best years of their lives, serving in the army, and trying to put their lives back together after the war was often difficult. And it was I'm sure it was even more difficult if you're a person of color. But James Fortin, he worked in a sail I can't remember the sail. I think it was a sail loft, and he was a free man, and he was a good worker, and he was very well liked by his white employer. So much so that after Fortin served during the war on a privateer ship, and I think they had one pretty successful voyage, and then he was captured by the British. But after he came home, he went back to the sail loft, resumed work, and eventually, and I don't know whether there was a deal whether Fortin was going to just pay back the cost of the business to his former employer or not, but his former employer basically ceded the business to him. So he ended up becoming relatively wealthy. And as Marvin-Alonzo said earlier, he became a moving light in the abolition movement. And at least I think one of two of his sons went on to serve in the Civil War in black regiments. So the whole family is really interesting. And Museum of the American Revolution did a wonderful exhibit on them, which talked about the whole family, which was really, really good. I don't know if there's ever any exhibit book put out from that, but I know there's a good biography on Fortin, though, and if anybody's interested in that, I can tell you about that.
His daughter was Charlotte. His daughter or granddaughter, Charlotte Fortin.
I think it was his granddaughter. I think
his granddaughter became a teacher, left Philadelphia, went down to the Sea Islands of Georgia, and had a friendship with Robert Gould Shaw, who was the commander of the 54th Massachusetts, and she helped really educate a lot of the Gullah Geechee people that were down there historically and brought up the plantations. And so that his legacy of fighting for freedom, he passed on not just to his children, but his grandchildren, which oftentimes we lose things after one generation. But the Fortin family had a generational legacy of fighting for freedom.
Yeah, amazing story.
This could go to either or both. And I've got 3 parts here. And all of them are connected. One is, if you could speak to short-term service, equal pay, blacks, whites, and Indian, and pensions as to referring to loyalists as opposed to your patriots.
Speak to pensions.
Cool, go ahead.
So when it came to pensions, you had to obviously apply for your pension. Literacy was a complication there. For loyalists, there was no pension. At least for black loyalists, there was no pension. If you were successful in being moved out with the British out of the colonies, you were resettled in one of the populations where they were. In Canada, you were given a plot of land, but you were also kind of put in the same community as a white loyalist as well. those white loyalists tended to have the same beliefs as the white patriots. They just were loyalists. And so you were still in a not great situation. Boston King talks about the complications of living there, the terrible conditions, the racism that they got. There were Hessian soldiers that fought with the British who opted not to go back to what's now Germany, and many stayed here in what becomes the United States. The Hessians that John talked about, the black men who served in Hessian units that John talked about, some of them did opt to go with the Germans the Hessians back to Germany. A colleague of mine who teaches, who's a German, he's done some research on them, and he's found letters from Hessian soldiers to their parents saying, "Hey, the bearer of this letter, I served with him in the revolution, in the war. He's trading places with me. Make sure he has a house and home, and yada yada yada." So this white soldier, this Hessian soldier, saying, "I'm staying here, and this is your new black son." What's happened to those soldiers, I think, has been lost to history. But there really was no pension for loyalists for the most part. Black patriot pensioners again had to appeal. There's another guy from Philly, Edward Hector, also known as Ned Hector, who served in an artillery regiment. He applied for pension, was denied. But the state of Pennsylvania, they didn't give him a pension, but they gave him some money late in life to survive off of. It wasn't a lot of money, but there's obviously with almost anything racial, and you know, I'd say there was a racial component between who got pensions, but white pension applicants it wasn't as easy like it is today to get your pension and things of that nature, because you had a fledgling government, as well as, like John was saying, these guys had really rough lives. Most of them were not the George Washingtons. Most of them were farmers, not really well educated.
I think I still have mine on. As far as equal pay, that's interesting because, like I said in the beginning of my talk, that stands out in the Revolution. The white, black, Indian, they all got equal pay. They got same clothing, same provisions. And as I said, you know, they all suffered together, you know, when things were going bad, which was often for the Continental Army. And then on the occasions when there was some bounty, they enjoyed it together. As you can see with the one Henry Hallowell, you know, his black comrades came to visit him after the war, and he gave him that, you know, that nice little brief encomium about them, which is, you know, it's short, but it's kind of sweet. The pay is interesting because during the American Civil War, at first they didn't want to form black regiments. They didn't want to tie slavery to the war, even though it was a basis for the conflict. In fact, the largest basis for the conflict. But they didn't want to tie slavery to the war, and they didn't want to have black men fighting. Some did though. Some did enlist in white regiments. Some of them served under arms. Most of them ended up serving as cooks or servants or whatever. By 1862, you had several independent movements to form black regiments. And one was the 54th Regiment, Massachusetts, and there was the 1st South Carolina, and then the 1st Kansas Regiment. And then the following year, the federal government decided, well, we're going to have U.S. colored troops. We're going to start enlisting regiments. The problem was the law that they wrote to actually allow that, it wasn't specifically military. It was read to read that like they were getting black laborers to support the army. But it was a law that was used as an excuse to basically enlist black regiments. And in that, it said that, I can't remember the figures entirely, but the pay was $13 a month. But the problem is, whereas white soldiers got paid all that, according to that one law, the black soldiers had $3 deducted from their pay for clothing and other allowances. So they never saw that until later at the very end of the war. They complained. I mean, even some soldiers, a lot of soldiers in the 54th, they wouldn't take their pay because they were so upset. And it wasn't until the last winter of the war when there was a law passed that would change that fact. But unfortunately, a lot of the men who were given short pay never received it. The 54th was one of them who did, and I think there were other regiments that actually did get their back pay, but a lot of the black soldiers didn't get their back pay. So yeah, that was a. And if you ever watch Glory, the movie Glory. That's a big part of the story in there.
And the last part of that, what did short-term service consist of?
In the Revolution?
Yes.
Well, with the militia, you could go out for a week, 2 weeks. You could go out for a month. Sometimes militia soldiers went out for a longer term for a special operation. Now, for the Continental Army, in the beginning, they were 1 year enlistments. So for the first 2 years of the war, 75, 76, there was a 1 year enlistment in the Continental Army, and then they had to re-enlist the regiments. Then in 1777, they started enlisting men for longer terms, either 3 years or for the duration of the war. And most of the men, actually, if you look at muster rolls, most of them signed on for the duration of the war. But then you have conscription for the Continental Army, which was drafting men out of the militia and then putting them into Continental regiments for a short term. And those terms ranged from 6 months to a year and a half. The year and a half was later in the war in Virginia, when they really needed men in Virginia because most of them had captured, or in the South because most of them had been captured at Charleston. They instituted a year and a half draft enlistment.
So in other words, then conscription and term of service was based on where you came from.
Basically, yeah. Like in 1778, there was a general 9-month draft, but it basically only it depended on the state whether they decided to do it or not. They could just rely on their old enlistment laws. I think 8 states did it that year, and then in 1780 there was a 6-month draft. And actually earlier in the war, there was an 8-month draft in 1776 and 77 for Connecticut, and they just did it entirely on their own. They were the earliest. So yeah, it was varying terms, and it just depended on what their legislatures decided to pass and what their need was. What's that?
8 colonies.
Yeah. Well, yeah, 8 colonies in 78 decided to pass the 9-month draft. Yeah. 8. Well, actually, at that point, 8 states. Any other questions?
One in the back.
Yeah, I have a question, and then I want to add something about the loyalists. So are you aware of any young soldiers that were young enough to then fight? Are you aware of any of the younger soldiers who were young enough to fight in 1812? That carried over into the next war?
I know there were white soldiers, and I think there was at least one black soldier that I've heard of, but I can't recall right now. Mm-hmm. But there were some older guys that were serving during the War of 1812, mostly in the militia, sometimes in the Navy. But as far as black Revolutionary veterans, at the moment I can't recall any right now.
Mm-hmm. I don't know any by name, but I can definitely think of some photographs of older, early black men who served in the War of 1812 who were in the Navy, because navies in general were more inclusive because it was a skilled job. Mm-hmm. You could train almost anyone in this room how to be a soldier for the most part in the 18th or 19th century. But operating on a ship was something that was highly skilled, and so you're going to see age limits and race be less of a serious concern as it is because you're not marching. So, can you climb the ropes? Can you cook? Can you fire the guns? Can you do the things that a ship needs? It's a little bit more inclusive that way.
Okay, and one of the things I wanted to add was an article that I received from Rich Gillespie over here, and he knew I was interested in the Loyalist. And so there was an article that came out in one of the local papers in the southwestern part of Virginia, where they had documentation that about 900 Virginians had joined the Loyalists. And those now descendants of those Loyalists are doing a reverse genealogy, such that they're saying, okay, and they're doing this with the state of Virginia. We know there were 900, now there are probably 10,000 people dispersed around the world, but we want to go back and see what parts of Virginia did they come from. And I think that's very interesting because they are also commemorating 250.
Oh, yeah.
And this is one of their projects. And if anybody's interested, I do have a small map that shows you the communities in Nova Scotia that they live in currently. Although we know, as you had said, Greer, they had gone to Sierra Leone, back to England, a lot in the Caribbean, but there's so many there still in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that I think they have about 2 or 3 heritage centers. I know they have 2. And so I guess they're telling us, if you come to Nova Scotia, come and see us.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yes, in the back.
Just following up on the idea of the draft, because I didn't realize that that was a thought in the revolution. I imagine it was incredibly variable, but what sort of parameters were they relying on to make the decision of who got drafted? I'm assuming that there were no people of color getting drafted.
Yeah, there were.
Was it?
Oh, yeah, there were. Yeah, sure.
Was it based on like land or property, or what were the parameters they were looking at?
Better yet, it was based on militia rolls.
Okay.
So basically, roughly, between 16 and 50, every able-bodied man is in the militia. So that was your source. It was a pretty wide net. I mean, some could buy substitutes to serve for them. Others could, depending on what they did. Sometimes they were excused because of what their trade was. The trades. I mean, there weren't that many excuses for trades. So you basically had to do what a lot of people did in the Civil War for the Union, is to buy a substitute. And then you wouldn't serve. And actually, if in some states, if you convinced 2 men to enlist in the Continental Army, you could be excused from militia service. So I mean, if you had the money and you could pay these 2 men to join the Continental Army, you didn't have to serve yourself at all.
And the laws were a little bit more opaque back than they are today. Even though a lot of states, especially the southern states, had banned black men from militia service. Your names are still, especially if you're free, your names are still on rolls of some sort, because you have to pay taxes or your tithes and things of that nature. And then they also looked past certain rules and regulations that they knew you in your community. So although the state of Virginia might say this is the law, in Loudoun County, that's just Jim over there. So again,
right.
Jim's not a violent one.
Yeah.
The rest of them are violent, but Jim's one of the good ones. So Jim, you're going to be serving the militia with this. And so we do have to consider, like Prince Estabrook is a good example of he's enslaved. Massachusetts also had a law that banned enslaved people from having firearms, but he was still allowed not only just to be in the militia, but to be in the Minutemen, which would not be expected. So really relying on your community saying, hey, this thing is okay, as opposed to what the state law said.
And another interesting thing is skin color. I mean, if you look at the San Domingue regiment, the companies were divided by color. There were black companies and there were light skinned companies, mulatto companies. During the war, you see men talking about basically talk about what their skin color was by calling themselves mulattoes. Now we don't know, there's variations in skin color. And my cousin and I were talking about this just yesterday. It's like, some of these guys were pretty light skinned, and some of them ended up passing themselves off as white after the war. So it's a really complicated and interesting subject. Some of the ones that I found for South Carolina, the free blacks down there, they were all mulattoes. I'm sure they were accepted within the community, probably accepted within the white community too. But it may have made skin color may have made a difference in service in South Carolina, because South Carolina was really vociferously a slave state at that point. Even at that point, Virginia was wavering as a slave state. They were passing some laws that could have gone either way. But South Carolina was just really they were set in slavery, and they weren't going to leave it. So it's.
When it comes to skin color and militia laws, because John was talking about the Civil War. One of the first, so prior to the Civil War, there was a black militia unit called the Louisiana Native Guard down in New Orleans. They were made up mostly of free men, probably people who were very fair skinned. Some of them were plantation owners themselves. And when Louisiana seceded from the Union, they changed their state constitution, which had, for centuries, or since the French and Spanish colonized it, had allowed for black, mulatto, Native American, anybody who bear arms to serve in the militia. And they explicitly banned black men or mulattoes, mixed race people, from serving the militia, except for in menial tasks. Tennessee did the exact same thing. So as you see, as time goes on, the role that black men can play in military service, especially in southern states, gets more and more restrictive as time goes on. And of course, the death knell of that was with secession, with those kind of last two southern states that had some wiggle room for black men in the South to be part of their militias. And then after the Civil War, black men were almost excluded. They tried to relegate how many National Guard units could be part of different states. And I think Virginia only had, one or two by the 1900s, something like that. But they're really, really small. So.
Can I ask one more question? First, my name is Larry Sims, and I taught history in the county for 44 years.
Wow.
During the Civil War, there were bounty jumpers, of course, jumping around and getting the pay. Now, during the Revolutionary War, how was pay received as far as different areas? For example, could I join a militia company here in Virginia and then rejoin somewhere in Southern Virginia? How was that garnered? Joining
militia service was by township and county.
Yes.
So different companies came from a certain township.
Right.
So it was geographical. So as far as you serving in another militia unit, you could do that if you moved from your present location to that other present location and were put on the tax rolls there, and or not just tax rolls, but recognized as a member of the community. And so for the militia, you couldn't do that really. Continental Army, no matter what period, everybody's human. So they had bounty jumpers in the Continental Army too. Yeah,
I just don't see how that could be, controlled as far as from county to county. How are we going to control people moving? And I guess the initial question was, when were you paid this entry, or how were you paid? Were you paid monthly? Were you paid after?
You mean for the Continental Army?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a different thing. You could live in South Carolina and well, actually, a good example is the 4th Georgia Regiment came up to Pennsylvania to recruit. The Georgia regiments also recruited in North Carolina and also in Virginia because the population of Georgia was not that much. The thing is, you got paid supposedly you got paid at the end of your end of the month, the pay month. The thing with the Continental Army is soldiers often didn't get paid, and then when they were paid, it was often paper. It was usually paper money, more often than not. But the pay is different from the bounty, though. If they're offering bounties, so because they need more soldiers, that's paid right up front, and that's why you get bounty jumpers, because they pay them right up front. They may serve like a week or two, and then they leave and take another bounty somewhere else. Yeah.
And part of westward expansion, quotes, stealing Native people's land out west, was to pay Rev War veterans. My ancestor was a recipient of that, and he also served. He was from Virginia, served for a Virginia militia unit for like 3 to 6 months, and then and then after that term was over, he went back home, and then went to a North Carolina, joined a North Carolina militia unit. And then he wound up getting land for payment for his service out in Tennessee, and so that payment isn't. So if you survived the war and you were able to move, you could get land elsewhere.
Yeah, the old Northwest Ohio and in that area, that's all begun on veterans' land, and a lot of the veterans, especially private soldiers, they got the land and they just sold their certificate off because they figured they weren't going to move, or they didn't have the money to move. So a lot of their buyers would basically go out and buy all kinds of certificates, and then they'd have this huge land holding, or at least in one or two places. So they took advantage of the soldiers that way. Yeah.
I know everybody's ready to go. I just have one more question. How did the Haitians get into the war in Savannah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
So the Haitians, technically at that point in time, they weren't considered Haitians. They were French subjects. So the Volunteers de Saint-Domingue would have been technically French soldiers. And when France allied themselves with the American cause, they were then sent up by France to serve. One of their drummers, Jean-Jacques, was a young man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who would later on become the first president of Haiti.
Okay.
If you look at the Haitians were deeply inspired by the American Revolution. If you look at their Declaration of Independence, it's really based off of the United States Declaration of Independence. And they looked to the United States for inspiration. We did not pay that, but the Haitians were deeply influenced by both the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution, which was partially inspired by the American Revolution. And so that's how they got involved.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that whole story of Saint-Domingue, Haiti is interesting. But one of the black battalions at New Orleans, one of the black battalions was filled mostly with Haitian immigrants, and they would have been the lighter skinned Haitians because for a period they were actually fighting with the whites. In other words, on the side of the whites against the black rebels, and at a certain point they emigrated to New Orleans, to Louisiana. So yeah, it's the whole story is really interesting if you look at it. If you go even further afield, if you look at all the way up to the 1950s, when even after 1948, when the army was integrated, there were still 2 black regiments serving in the Korean War, the 24th Regiment, and there was an artillery regiment, but I can't remember the name of it. So yeah, it's a fascinating story, and yeah.
Well, thank you. Join me in thanking. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our partners, the Black History Committee of the Friends of the Thomas Balch Library, the Circuit Court Historic Records Room, who are set up in that other room. So please, after we're done today, please go over and visit with them. And then also John has his new book for sale and signing out there, correct?
Yeah, and I can tell you more about getting free stuff too.
And more about free stuff too. So you don't have to leave, but we should wrap up just to respect everybody's everybody's time now. And then I hope to see you again next Saturday, March 8th, is about the people who were enslaved at Oak Hill, which is President Monroe's plantation just down the road, and then again on March 22nd. So thank you again. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.